Well, Dr. Shepard, thank you so much for talking with me today. I'm always grateful to hear from you, and I learned so much. And I'm really excited for this conversation about climate impacts and climate solutions in Georgia. So, first, the impacts. I know your scholarship in part looks at the impacts of a changing climate. And you often say that these impacts are not something that's waiting for us in some distant future, but instead are really kitchen table issues relevant today. So, can you share how Georgians are seeing and feeling the impacts of climate change in our state right now?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me, Blair. And you're spot on. I mean, I actually even get a little frustrated at times when I hear people talk about climate change and they say things like, we're going to expect this or we're going to see more of that. We have to stop using future tense. These things are here and now. They are happening right now. The scientific literature is pretty clear that the DNA of climate change is in today's heat waves. As we're recording this, we're coming out of a period of extreme heat, triple digit temperatures and heat indices. And the literature is fairly conclusive. I was an author on a report from the National Academy of Sciences. It said intensity and frequency of heat waves today have the DNA of climate change in them. The intensity of Georgia rainstorms, the intensity of those top 1-2% level intense rainstorms are much different than they were in 1950 and 1960 and 70. And that's why we're seeing greater urban flooding in many of our cities in Georgia, like Atlanta, Augusta, and Savannah, and so forth. The infrastructure was designed for last century's rainstorms, but we have a different type of rainstorm now. Georgia's a big agricultural state. We are creeping into or inching into a little bit of a drought right now here in early summer of 2022. We know drought intensity and frequency is now different. These aren't things that are going to happen. They are happening now. The intensity of hurricanes, our crops in Southwest Georgia after Hurricane Michael devastated much of the Southwest Georgia agricultural crops of all types. And some of those were nationwide leading industry providers. So we saw a ripple effect throughout our economy. That's how Georgians are experiencing climate change. Sea level rise in the coast. I mean, you talk to people that live in the coastal communities, they'll talk to you about levels of sunny day flooding, blue sky flooding that they're seeing, potential concerns about, I guess, something called black gill and some of the shrimping industry and in those coastal regions. Excuse me. So those are just the tip of the iceberg. And I didn't even talk about the climate risk and vulnerability index that we developed at the University of Georgia, which points to which counties in Georgia are most vulnerable. From our research here at the University of Georgia, we have a sense of what counties are most vulnerable and why, not just related to the weather climate impacts. It's related to who's impacted in those counties in terms of vulnerable populations. So that's why I say these are kitchen table issues. They're not about polar bears, monarch butterflies, the year 2080. They're about our water supply, food supply, health, infrastructure, and well-being today.
Well, you touched on kind of my next question, but I'm hoping we can drill down a little. We know these impacts are just not felt evenly across our communities. And low income and BIPOC communities, they often bear a disproportionate burden. So, can you talk a little bit about some of your work and your research that looks at those disproportionate impacts?
Yeah, it's clear that every single person on the planet is impacted by climate change. And so we're not sort of setting anyone apart. But the research is also clear that because of large wealth and income gaps in this country and around the world for that matter, there are some people that are disproportionately affected by these impacts. So I'll give you an example. We can go back to Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 in New Orleans, because I think a lot of people still remember that storm. Everybody in the Gulf Coast region, like Louisiana, New Orleans, Mississippi, were impacted by the hurricane. They were exposed to it. But there were some people in those communities that had greater sensitivity to that exposure and had less ability to bounce back from the exposure. We call that adaptive capacity or resilience. And so those people we saw in the Superdome needing food, water, shelter, medical care, those are the people that were of greatest sensitivity and least amount of adaptive capacity. Some of the people that, had impacts in some of the more affluent communities, they were equally impacted, but they have the ability to bounce back. They have housing insurance. They could hop in their cars and leave and go inland and stay in a hotel for a week. Many people can't afford to do that. So that's just an example of what I've been calling in talks that I give the extreme weather climate gap. And it's related directly to the income gap or wealth gap in this country. And so we know elderly communities, children, people of color, poor communities are particularly at greatest sensitivity to extreme weather and climate events, and often have the least ability to bounce back. I will say, even more locally here in Georgia, we've been doing research. Some of my research is really focused on urban climate. And we know that the urban heat island exists in cities. Couple that with heat waves and broader climate change warming. And we have found that in Atlanta, for example, and it's likely true in other cities, there are heat islands within the heat island, and they're hotter. And this in some of the marginalized, underserved communities that are experiencing that. And we call that the racialized, or RUHI, because it's really adding a socioeconomic impact on something that we've known about in urban climate for a while.
Well, Drawdown Georgia is really focused on climate solutions and what we can be doing right now in our state to start reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that are fueling this crisis. And more, those climate solutions are also kitchen table issues for people across our state, whether it's whether to purchase an electric vehicle or install rooftop solar, compost at home. So how do you think about climate solutions as kitchen table issues?
Well, they are, because we have to. That's the space, and I appreciate the Drawdown Georgia and the Ray C. Anderson Foundation is really moving the needle forward in our state. And frankly, we're leaders nationally and internationally. I think people are now looking to Georgia because of what we have done with things like the Drawdown Georgia Project or the Georgia Climate Project. There are people often ask me when I give climate talks, well, what can I do? Well, the first thing that I say is you just got to be engaged in terms of climate, being a climate voter, because we have to have large scale change. We saw the recent bipartisan infrastructure bill. That wasn't a red or blue bill. I mean, that had bipartisan support, and it's going to do some things to increase infrastructure that can improve climate change solutions, things like EV stations, retrofitting school buses that are diesel now, and so forth. So just being climate aware. But then you think about many of the solutions that emerged out of the Drawdown Georgia project in phase one, if you will. There are things that people can do in their own homes. I was just out back at my house dumping the compost out of into my compost bins. Food waste is one of the biggest sources of methane when it goes into our landfills. And so just think about the amount of food waste that comes out of our own homes in a given week. And we can actually compost that and keep it out of the landfills and reduce that methane buildup. I drive an electric vehicle. People are saying, oh, you're an elitist. Don't talk to me about electric vehicles. They're too expensive for the average person, or there's no access, and so forth. And right now that may somewhat be true, but transitioning to electric vehicles, hybrids, and so forth will dramatically reduce our carbon emissions. And I think it's a way to equalize equity, provide equity as well, because imagine the poor homes right now, they're paying exorbitant amounts for gas, $5, $6, $7 a gallon for gas, and they experience these variations and whims in the gas prices. If we can move to a point where we have more people on electric vehicles, they're shielded from the fossil fuel gas tax, essentially, they get every time we see these large increases. And so we have to increase infrastructure, and we have to have them available in like multi-family housing and those types of things, but we'll get there. So, there are community solar programs. Increasingly more people are putting solar panels on their homes and so forth. These are ways that you can engage at the kitchen table in your own home level. And I think that's important. Planting trees, vegetation, and so forth. These are all incremental. I don't want anyone to think that these individual actions alone are enough, but they certainly can help. Even simple things that we found in Drawdown Georgia in terms of how our diet, the reducing, meat, or, family planning and various things. So the Drawdown Georgia effort was a really comprehensive way of thinking about sort of large scale solutions, but also some of these solutions that can be done at the individual household level as well.
Well, thanks for that. I have one more question for you.
Sure.
We are really fortunate to have you working here in Georgia, both because of your scholarship as well as your commitment to communicating that expertise with the rest of us outside of academia. And as you have been talking to people across Georgia, have you noticed a change in how Georgians are thinking about or talking about climate change impacts and climate solutions?
I do. There's still sort of what I call the 7 to 9% dismissive crowd. The Yale Climate Communication Group does the Six Americas study every year. And there is about 7%, 9% of the population that you're just, no matter what you say, they're going to be dismissive, or they're going to bring the sort of zombie theories that I call them, that we all hear, things that have been long refuted. So you just have to kind of shove that noise to the side and focus on the signal, because I do believe that Georgians are coming around. I think people can sort of see what's going on with the heat and rainstorms and hurricanes. I mean, they perceive something to be different. I think that, Georgia, quiet as kept, is really a leader in really in sort of solar programs. And, we just had 2 or 3, companies announced that they're going to be building electric vehicles in the state. And so forth. There's an electric battery plant that has sprung up on Interstate 85 up in Northeast Georgia. So while there may be rhetoric at times in this state, quietly, Georgia is really doing some good things in the area of solution space for the nation and climate. Now, they'll frame it in the sort of policy circles as about economic development and economic drivers, but quietly, we are enabling an EV infrastructure right here in the state. We have adopted solar. I drive down Interstate 75 now, look at these large solar panel farms. I think farmers are understanding the variability of drought and so forth. So people are changing their thought process. And what's encouraging to me is I talk to people and policymakers from both sides of the political aisle that seem to get it. I mean, I remember the last Georgia Climate Conference down in Jekyll Island. I think we had some opening remarks from the governor, right? So and so forth. So we are starting to slowly. I won't even say slowly. I think we're starting to see a recognition that this is a new economy emerging in terms of a renewable energy economy. You hear people in the state talking about nuclear power, renewable energy. I see commercials from Georgia Power all the time touting their renewable energy portfolio. So that's a shift even from 5-10 years ago.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shepard. We really appreciate your time today and sharing these thoughts with us.
Thank you so much, Blair, for having me. And thank you for all that you and the Ray C. Anderson Foundation continue to do for our state and our nation.
Thank you.